So today's lesson is on presidential elections. Here you see a useful overview of the processes, the primaries and caucuses, the national conventions, the general election, the electoral college, which we'll talk about quite a bit at the end, the basic requirements. You have to be a natural born citizen, 35 years old, and a U.S. resident for 14 years. So here are those requirements. Again, they're set out in Article 2 of the Constitution. A natural born citizen of the United States does not have to mean literally born in the continental United States. It does include those people, but it could be people born elsewhere, like on military bases perhaps, who meet the legal requirements for birthright citizenship. As far as the 35 years old, you can begin campaigning before you turn 35 or before you complete 14 years of residency, but you have to meet the age and residency requirements by inauguration day in order to be constitutionally eligible. Now, presidential elections occur once every 4 years. Registered voters cast their ballots on election day. Since 1845, election day has been the first Tuesday after November the 1st. So if November the 1st is a Tuesday, then November the 8th, the following Tuesday, will be election day. Now on election day, the voters decide which candidate's slate of electors will cast ballots for them in the Electoral College. The electors meet in the state capitals on the Monday following the second Wednesday of December to cast their electoral votes. And the candidates need a majority of the electoral votes to win. That's 270 electoral votes out of the 538 that are eligible, that are possible. Congress then certifies those results in early January, and the presidential term begins on Inauguration Day, which is January 20. And it's been set at January 20 since the 20th Amendment was passed. So the nominating process. The presidential election is an amalgamation of separate state elections rather than a single national election. So what we have is basically 50 simultaneous elections, run by different states. Candidates must submit separate filings in each of the 50 states to qualify on each state's ballot, and the requirements for filing vary by state. Now the two main parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are so powerful and heavily populated that filing is not a big problem for them, but occasionally third parties have had trouble filing in all 50 states and have not been eligible in some states because of that. So primary elections are generally held between January and June before the general election in November, and nominating conventions are held in the summer. Iowa and New Hampshire traditionally hold the first presidential state caucus and state primary. And citizens in each state vote in their party's primary election to choose delegates to the National Convention, where the nominee is officially chosen. So in 2024, Texas will have a nomination, an election to choose the nominee for president. There will be a Democratic Party primary election, and there will be a Republican Party primary. You can vote in either one of those that you want. You don't have to be a member of the party to vote. And when you vote, what you are technically doing, so suppose in 2024 I vote in the Democratic primary in Texas and I vote for Mickey Mouse. I am choosing one of Mickey Mouse's supporters to go to the party convention and vote for him on my behalf at that party convention. Does that make sense? I'm choosing a representative to vote the way I want at the convention. And then they have the convention in the summer. The Democrats do, the Republicans do, other parties do as well, but they're not as important. And there they officially choose the nominee. I'm going to talk about the Electoral College more at the end, but to mention it briefly now. So the Electoral College and its procedure are established in the U.S. Constitution. Under Article 2, Clause 2, each state casts as many electoral votes as the total number of its senators and representatives in Congress. In 1961, the ratification of the 23rd Amendment granted electors to the District of Columbia and an equal amount to the number of electors allocated to the least populous state, which means 3. U.S. territories are not allocated electors and therefore are not represented in the Electoral College. So Puerto Rico, for example, is a U.S. territory. The people who are born there and live there are U.S. citizens, but they do not vote in presidential elections. They have no electors. In the District of Columbia, they do vote for the president. They are given 3 electors. Under Clause 2, the manner for choosing electors is determined by each state legislature, not by the federal government. And in the early years of our country, many state legislatures selected their electors, but now all use the popular vote to choose electors. There is something called a faithless elector. So generally, electors cast their electoral ballots for the candidate who won the plurality in their state. Those who vote in opposition to the plurality are known as faithless or unpledged electors. That means, for example, in 2020, Donald Trump won the electors in Texas, and so he was supposed to receive all 38 of those votes, but I think there was 1 or 2 faithless electors in Texas. I don't remember for sure. I think there was 1. And that means the person voted for somebody else despite being pledged to vote for who won the majority. And that has happened throughout American history. In 2016, there was a faithless elector who didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. And going back many years, that happens from time to time. There has never been a faithless elector who determined the outcome of an election. So it has happened, but it's never determined the outcome of an election. In 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution does not require that people elected to serve in the Electoral College be free to vote as they choose. The court held that states have the constitutional power to force electors to vote according to the state's popular vote. At the time of the decision, 32 states had passed laws that bound electors, while 18 states had laws on the books giving electors the freedom to vote independently. So if Texas wants to, it could pass a law saying electors must vote for whoever wins the popular vote. They have no choice in the matter. I don't recall that we've done so. No, we don't, sorry. It says right there on the map. We don't have any such law, but we could if we wanted to. Most of the time, the winner of a U.S. presidential election also wins the national popular vote, but there have been times when that didn't occur. Here it says 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, and 2016. In 1824, I'm not sure how accurate of a popular vote count there really was, but it's probably true that Andrew Jackson won the most raw votes, but did not become president. And I'll mention the other 4 later on in the lecture. So what if there's no majority in the Electoral College? In 1824, we did clearly have that result. What happened here is there were 4 candidates who ran for president and got at least some portion of the electoral vote. Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and a 4th guy named Crawford from Georgia. So you can see Crawford won Virginia, Georgia, and Delaware, and a little slice of New York. Jackson won all the green states. Adams won the northeastern states and most of New York. And Clay won a few states, Ohio, Kentucky, and Missouri, and a little slice of New York. Now, Jackson won, according to this count, 43% of the popular vote, not a majority, but a plurality. And he also won more electoral votes than anyone else. He won 99 electoral votes. Crawford 41, and Adams 84, and Clay in fourth place was 37. But if no one receives a majority of the electoral votes, Jackson had more than anyone else, a plurality but not a majority, then the House of Representatives decides who's going to become president. In order to do so, they each get one vote per state. So every state in the union gets one vote. The representatives in the House decide how that vote's going to go for Crawford or for Jackson or for Adams. And the outcome of that vote in 1824 was that John Quincy Adams became president, even though he had finished in second place in the electoral vote and in second place in the popular vote. But that was the way the Constitution says. The House of Representatives can choose any of the three top vote getters, but they are not obligated to choose the person who won a plurality. Okay, campaign spending. So in 2020, we had the highest spending ever recorded. You see spending by Democrats and spending by Republicans. The Democrats outspent the Republicans in 2020. The blue here is much bigger than the red. There have been various laws passed over the last 15 years to try to limit or control campaign spending. So the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 was enacted to increase disclosure of contributions for federal campaigns. In 1974, the act was amended to create the Federal Election Commission, or the FEC, and to place legal limits on campaign contributions and expenditures. The law requires that candidates to a federal office file a statement of candidacy with the Federal Election Commission before they can receive contributions in excess of $5,000. In addition to limiting the size of contributions, the FEC requires campaigns and political committees to report the names, addresses, and occupations of donors of more than $200. Here you see the rules, the limits in place for 2021 and 2022. You don't have to memorize this chart by any stretch, but I do have one question on our review questions about the chart. So you just have to be able to read it. You can see here that donors is on the left, recipients is on top, and an individual donor can give up to $2,900 to a candidate committee per election. So I assume Joe Biden will run for president again in 2024. If I want to, I can give $2,900 to the Joe Biden for President committee. There will be PACs, political action committees. I can give $5,000 per year to them. A state, district, or local party committee, I can give $10,000 per year or $36,500 to a national party committee. I can give it to the Republican Party Committee, the Democratic Party Committee, the Green Party Committee, whatever I want. A little bit about political parties. The first president, George Washington, was elected as an independent. After him, every president has represented one of two major political parties. Third parties have taken second place only twice in American history, in 1860 and 1912. And the last time we had a third party, a candidate that achieved any significant amount of success, was 30 years ago. In 1992, Ross Perot ran. He received no electoral votes, but he did receive almost 20% of the popular vote, and that's the last time a third party candidate has had a major impact, I think, on a presidential election. Now what I want to do is go through the last 30 years of presidential elections and just give you what I think is some interesting information or insights or about trends that we can pick out over these elections. And that might give you some idea what to look for in the elections coming up in 2024. So in 1992, Bill Clinton defeated George H.W. Bush and Ross Perot. Notice Clinton got 370 electoral votes, which is more than twice as much as Bush, who came in second place. And Clinton also won a plurality of the popular vote. He got 43% compared to 37.5% by Bush. Notice, I mentioned this just a few seconds ago, Perot got 18.9% of the popular vote. Almost 20 million Americans voted for Perot, but he didn't get any electoral votes. He didn't carry a single state. Right? So he was influential in the race, but didn't come close to winning in the Electoral College. There was a debate for many years, maybe still is, about who Perot helped and who he hurt in this election. There were people who thought that he prevented George Bush from being reelected. Because the idea is most of the people who voted for Perot would have voted for Bush if Perot wasn't running. But there are other people who say no, Perot didn't have any effect. His votes were evenly split, would have been evenly split between Clinton and Bush, and who knows. Notice Texas is red in 1992. Notice California is blue. We'll see that in the next 30 years, neither of those results ever changes. Kind of interesting. In 1996, Bill Clinton wins re-election over Bob Dole, and again, Ross Perot. Now, notice Clinton's margin of victory is wider here in the electoral vote and in the popular vote. Last time in 1992, he got 370 electoral votes. Now he gets 379. And he gets a larger percentage of the popular vote as well, 49.2%. He still didn't get 50%. If I remember correctly, Clinton was the first and only American president to win an election twice without ever getting a majority of the vote, of the popular vote. Notice Perot's support declined significantly. He only got 8.4% of the vote. 8 million people voted for him. That's still a lot, but he wasn't nearly as big a factor as he had been 4 years earlier. Oh, and I said Clinton's margin of victory was wider. How do I phrase this? Only 2 times in American history has the president won re-election in a narrower race than he won the first time. Franklin Roosevelt in 1936 and Barack Obama in 2012. Normally, throughout American history, if a president wins re-election, the margin of victory is bigger the second time than it was the first. And what that suggests is if people are basically happy with the way the country is going, they re-elect the president in bigger margins. If they're not happy with the country is going, usually they don't re-elect him at all. Right? But in 2 cases, Obama in 2012 and FDR in 1936, they weren't happy with the direction the country was going. We were in the middle of the Great Depression in 1936, and we had a major recession in 2012, but the president still had just enough support to get re-elected anyway. In 2000, we had one of the closest and most contentious elections in American history. George Bush defeated Al Gore. Notice only 5 electoral votes is the margin of victory, 271 to 266. And notice Al Gore got about 500,000 more votes than George Bush did. So Bush actually got a smaller percentage of the popular vote than Gore did. And at the time, this was the first time in over 100 years that it happened. So it was big, big news at the time. Of course, the biggest news, if you've ever seen the video or documentary about this, the election came down to a dispute in Florida. And for over a month, Florida was up in the air. There were fights in state courts, there were fights in federal courts. Gore wanted to recount 3 heavily Democratic counties to try to boost his results there. And then they went back and forth all the way up to the US Supreme Court, which in December finally stopped the process at whatever the most recent count was up until then. There were like 3 recounts of the state. And Bush narrowly won Florida by a few hundred votes, which meant all 25 of Florida's votes went into his category, and he won a close election. In 2004, Bush wins re-election, but notice this time, like I said, he wins re-election by a bigger margin. He does win the popular vote, 50.7 to 48.3, and he wins by 35 points in the Electoral College. So a very close race, but a clear victory for Bush. And this one really all came down to Bush winning Florida again and winning Ohio. Ohio was very important and very close in the 2004 election. In 2008, Barack Obama won, and there's nothing really that stands out about this one except it was a fairly comfortable victory for Obama. He won by 10 million, he had 10 million more votes than McCain did. And he had actually a little bit more than twice as many votes in the electoral college, 365 to 173. Notice the percentage, almost 53% of the people voted for Barack Obama, 52.9%. And then that historical anomaly that I mentioned earlier. In the next campaign, President Obama was reelected, but it was much closer. It was 332 to 206. It was closer in the Electoral College. The number of people who voted for Obama actually went down. About 4 million people who had voted for him in 2008 voted for Romney, but it wasn't enough to prevent him from being reelected. And you can see in the percentages, the margin is narrower. Notice that Obama won Florida, hugely important, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. These are states that are going to be very important just 4 years later. So 2016 was one of the most contentious, controversial, interesting presidential elections in history for a lot of reasons. You guys might, unfortunately, actually be too young to really appreciate this, but I saw polls in 2016 suggesting that these were the 2 most unpopular presidential candidates ever. And that made everything kind of funny. So Hillary Clinton was under investigation by the FBI during the campaign for, I want to say allegedly, but for clearly misappropriating top secret emails. Donald Trump was in all sorts of trouble for things he said that were allegedly racist and sexist, and he was accused of doing sexist things as well, sexual harassment. So both of these folks had historically bad approval ratings going into the election. A second unusual thing is that Hillary Clinton was heavily favored going into election day. And when I woke up on the morning of the 2016 election, the stories online in the newspapers were how big of a margin will she win by, not whether or not she'll win. She ended up losing in probably the greatest upset in American presidential election history. And if you look at the map, Trump won Texas, except for 2 faithless electors who voted for someone else. But that's no story. Republicans have won Texas every year since 1980. But Trump won Florida. Ever since 2000 and the Bush versus Gore race, people have watched Florida carefully every 4 years to see what will happen. Trump won Ohio. There were 18 votes. This was important because going back to the 1800s, Republicans had never won the presidency without winning Ohio. And so on election night in 2024, if you want to watch the results, I guarantee you somebody will talk about this. Somebody will say, let's look at Ohio. For some reason, whatever the reason is, Republicans have to win Ohio. If they don't, they're always in trouble. That's just seems to be the case. But that's where it gets now it gets even more interesting. Trump won Pennsylvania. This was the first time in decades a Republican had won Pennsylvania. He won Michigan. It was the first time in 30 or 40 years a Republican had won Michigan. He won Wisconsin. It was the first time since, I think, the 1980s that a Republican had won Wisconsin. So this was, on top of all the weird things about the investigations and the controversial remarks that the two of them had made, this had states voting for a Republican that hadn't done so in about 40 years. And that was very, very interesting and very unusual. And then last, of course, I have to mention 3 million more people almost voted for Clinton than Trump. And yet, even though he got 2% less of the popular vote, he had almost 80 more electoral votes than she did, and he won the Electoral College and won the presidency. I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. In 2020, Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump, so he was not reelected. Biden had a pretty hefty margin, 7 million more votes than Trump in the popular vote, and a 74-point margin in the Electoral College. Why was this outcome different? How was Biden able to defeat Trump? The main story is these states that Trump had surprised everybody by winning in 2016 went back to the Democratic side in 2020. Right? Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Biden even shocked people by winning a very, very, very close race in Georgia, which had traditionally been a Republican state. So, and of course there were countless allegations of electoral discrepancies and all sorts of things, but we won't go into those. This map shows you red wall states. These are states that have been voting Republican for many years. Texas down here since 1980 has never voted for a Democrat. So as long as you guys have been alive. And in 2024, Texas will almost certainly vote for a Republican again. Right? There are people who talk about Texas moving gradually back to the Democratic side, and they may be right, probably in 10 or 20 years, but for now, it's still pretty safely a Republican state. It's even harder. Look at some of these states. Oklahoma has voted Republican since 1968. So you'd have to go back. Almost 60 years to find Oklahoma voting for a Democrat. But there are also blue wall states. California has voted for Democrats since 1992, and so has Oregon and Washington. And so have all of these other states, except for 2016, when some of them voted for Trump. And these are those exceptions that I just mentioned. So in 2016, a very, very unusual, fascinating election where Trump was beaten by 3 million votes in the popular vote by Clinton, but because he narrowly won Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, among other things, he was able to squeak into the presidency in that very, very close election. So all of that brings me to this. There's constantly debate and discussion about the Electoral College, whether or not it works, whether or not it's worth it, whether or not it diminishes the value of your vote. And I want to address that question just a little bit. So, let's see if I can get this to play. Okay, we'll start with this video. It's just a nice little overview of the Electoral College and why it was created and how it was created and how it works and that sort of thing.
Most people have heard of the Electoral College during presidential election years. But what exactly is the Electoral College? Simply said, it is a group of people appointed by each state who formally elect the President and Vice President of the United States. To understand how this process began and how it continues today, we can look at the Constitution of the United States. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution. It specifies how many electors each state is entitled to have. Since 1964, there have been 538 electors in each presidential election. How did they decide on the number 538? Well, the number of electors is equal to the total voting membership of the United States Congress, 435 representatives plus 100 senators and 3 electors from the District of Columbia. Essentially, the Democratic candidate and Republican candidate are each trying to add up the electors in every state so that they surpass 270 electoral votes, or just over half of 538 votes, and win the presidency. So how do states even get electoral votes? Each state receives a particular number of electors based on population size. The census is conducted every 10 years, so every time the census happens, states might gain or lose a few electoral votes. Let's say you're a voter in California, a state with 55 electoral votes. If your candidate wins in California, they get all 55 of the state's electoral votes. If your candidate loses, they get none. This is why many presidential candidates want to win states like Texas, Florida, and New York. If you currently add up the electoral votes of those 3 states, you would have 96 electoral votes. Even if a candidate won North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and West Virginia, they would only gain 31 electoral votes total from those 8 states. Here's where it can get a little tricky. On a rare occasion, like in the year 2000, someone can win the popular vote but fail to gain 270 electoral votes. This means that the winner may have won and collected their electoral votes by small margins, winning just enough states with just enough electoral votes, but the losing candidate may have captured large voter margins in the remaining states. If this is the case, the very large margins secured by the losing candidate in the other states would add up to over 50% of the ballots cast nationally. Therefore, the losing candidate may have gained more than 50% of the ballots cast by voters, but failed to gain 270 of the electoral votes. Some critics of the Electoral College argue the system gives an unfair advantage to states with large numbers of electoral votes. Think of it this way. It is possible for a candidate to not get a single person's vote, not one vote, in 39 states or the District of Columbia, yet be elected president by winning the popular vote in just 11 of these 12 states: California, New York, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, New Jersey, North Carolina, Georgia, or Virginia. This is why both parties pay attention to these states. However, others argue that the Electoral College protects small states such as Rhode Island, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and even geographically large states with small populations like Alaska, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. That's because a candidate can't completely ignore small states because in a close election, every electoral vote counts. There are certain states that have a long history of voting for a particular party. These are known as safe states. For the past 4 election cycles, in 1996, 2000, 2004, and 2008, Democrats could count on states like Oregon, Maryland, Michigan, and Massachusetts, whereas the Republicans could count on states like Mississippi, Alabama, Kansas, and Idaho. States that are teetering between parties are called swing states. In the past 4 election cycles, Ohio and Florida have been swing states, twice providing electoral votes for a Democratic candidate and twice providing electoral votes for a Republican candidate. Think about it. Do you live in a safe state? If so, is it a Democratic or Republican safe state? Do you live in a swing state? Are your neighboring states swing or safe? Is the population in your state increasing or decreasing? And do not forget, when you're watching the electoral returns on election night every 4 years and the big map of the United States is on the screen, know that the magic number is 270 and start adding.
Okay.
Most people have heard of the Electoral College during presidential election years. But what exactly is the Electoral College? Simply said, it is a group of people appointed by each state who formally elect the President and Vice President of the United States. To understand how this process began and how it continues today, we can look at the Constitution of the United States. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution. It specifies how many electors each state is entitled to have. Since 1964, there have been 538 electors in each presidential election. How did they decide on the number 538? Well, the number of electors is equal to the total voting membership of the United States Congress, 435 representatives plus 100 senators and 3 electors from the District of Columbia. Essentially, the Democratic candidate and Republican candidate are each trying to add up the electors in every state so that they surpass 270 electoral votes, or just over half of 538 votes, and win the presidency. So how do states even get electoral votes? Each state receives a particular number of electors based on population size. The census is conducted every 10 years, so every time the census happens, states might gain or lose a few electoral votes. Let's say you're a voter in California, a state with 55 electoral votes. If your candidate wins in California, they get all 55 of the state's electoral votes. If your candidate loses, they get none. This is why many presidential candidates want to win states like Texas, Florida, and New York. If you currently add up the electoral votes of those 3 states, you would have 96 electoral votes. Even if a candidate won North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and West Virginia, they would only gain 31 electoral votes total from those 8 states. Here's where it can get a little tricky. On a rare occasion, like in the year 2000, someone can win the popular vote but fail to gain 270 electoral votes. This means that the winner may have won and collected their electoral votes by small margins, winning just enough states with just enough electoral votes, but the losing candidate may have captured large voter margins in the remaining states. If this is the case, the very large margins secured by the losing candidate in the other states would add up to over 50% of the ballots cast nationally. Therefore, the losing candidate may have gained more than 50% of the ballots cast by voters, but failed to gain 270 of the electoral votes. Some critics of the Electoral College argue the system gives an unfair advantage to states with large numbers of electoral votes. Think of it this way. It is possible for a candidate to not get a single person's vote, not one vote, in 39 states or the District of Columbia, yet be elected president by winning the popular vote in just 11 of these 12 states: California, New York, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, New Jersey, North Carolina, Georgia, or Virginia. This is why both parties pay attention to these states. However, others argue that the Electoral College protects small states such as Rhode Island, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and even geographically large states with small populations, like Alaska, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. That's because a candidate can't completely ignore small states, because in a close election, every electoral vote counts. There are certain states that have a long history of voting for a particular party. These are known as safe states. For the past 4 election cycles, in 1996, 2000, 2004, and 2008, Democrats could count on states like Oregon, Maryland, Michigan, and Massachusetts, whereas the Republicans could count on states like Mississippi, Alabama, Kansas, and Idaho. States that are teetering between parties are called swing states. In the past 4 election cycles, Ohio and Florida have been swing states, twice providing electoral votes for a Democratic candidate and twice providing electoral votes for a Republican candidate. Think about it. Do you live in a safe state? If so, is it a Democratic or Republican safe state? Do you live in a swing state? Are your neighboring states swing or safe? Is the population in your state increasing or decreasing? And do not forget, when you're watching the electoral returns on election night every 4 years and the big map of the United States is on the screen, know that the magic number is 270 and start adding.
So there is debate, and has been for many years, about whether or not the Electoral College is a good idea, or was a good idea, should be abolished. I'll just briefly mention some of the arguments that people who are in favor of keeping the Electoral College make. So one, they like the idea that it forces political parties who want to win, political candidates who want to win a presidential election, to have broadly distributed national support geographically. In other words, a presidential candidate who is wildly popular in Texas but loved nowhere else is never going to be president, right? Just can't. You have to be able to get states to vote for you, not just a few people, but majorities in states all over the country. Another argument is that it enhances minority influence. Now, minority could mean a racial or ethnic minority or a linguistic minority, or it could just mean a business minority, like a certain type of business or job. It could mean an interest group that's a minority. So, for example, there might be a state like Georgia, where black voters are about 50% of the population, or close to it. Mississippi, like 50% of the population. And so they're going to have an enormous clout with presidential candidates who want to win that state, right? They can't ignore that minority. I said it could affect minorities in terms of business, not just race or ethnicity. In the Midwest, like in Iowa, people who grow corn are really, really important. Corn farmers are extremely important. So a presidential candidate needs to take them seriously. Even though they're a minority of the United States as a whole, they're very influential in that state, so they can't be ignored. So another argument is that it leads to two-party stability. And what we mean by this is that the Electoral College process forces minority party voters to merge into one of the two major parties. Likewise, the two major parties seeking the votes to win the election can mold their platforms to gain the votes of minority party movements. Let me give you a specific example of what I mean by this, and I'm going to go way back 50 years ago. In the 1970s, Texas was almost a battleground state. And what I mean by that is you had one Democratic senator and you had one Republican senator. You had Texas, you had a governor who was Republican, elected in 1978. You had Jimmy Carter, who was a Democrat, win Texas's votes in the presidential election in 1976. But you had Reagan, who was a Republican, won Texas's votes in 1980. So you had a state where it was close enough, a long time ago, that both parties thought they had a shot in elections in Texas, right? And they tried. You also had a very interesting phenomenon, an obscure third party that probably none of you have ever heard of before. It was called the Raza Unida Party. And you can tell by the name, the party was designed primarily to appeal to Mexican Americans, and primarily in one part of Texas, in the valley, in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. And they never got more than, in most of these elections, they didn't run candidates for president, but they ran candidates for senator, governor, and they never got more than 1 or 2% of the vote. But in a very close race, can you change the outcome by getting 1 or 2% of the vote? Yes. I looked at this race. Again, the Raza Unida Party, he only got 1 or 2% of the vote. It was not much at all. But the race was so close that it affected the outcome. You see what I mean? And so what does the Democratic Party do in Texas if that's going on? Suppose you're a Democrat and you're looking at all these close elections and you're saying, this third party over here, they're getting a tiny bit of the vote, but that's keeping us from winning. What do we have to do? If I want that vote, what do I have to do? Huh? I have to campaign, yes. I have to campaign for the people who are voting for them. I have to figure out what is it about them that this 1 or 2% likes. How can I get them to stop voting for this third party and vote for me instead? And that's what they did. Likewise, if you're a member of this party and you've campaigned for Senate and you've campaigned for governor in 72, 74, 76, 78, and you've never even come close to winning, right? You're getting 1 or 2% of the vote, tops. And it finally dawns on you, we could spend the rest of our lives doing this and we're never gonna win. Or, what do? If we wanna have a real shot at being elected, what do? You join one of the two parties, yeah. Otherwise, you'll have to be content with spoiling elections, but what fun is that? If you want to really win an election, you're gonna have to pick one of these two parties and join it. And that means two-party stability. That means third parties don't live very long because they either join one of the major parties or one of the major parties comes in and kind of swoops them up. It says, okay, I'm gonna figure out why these people are voting for you. I'm gonna offer them the same thing, and then the third party just disappears, right? Because the major party's kind of gotten its voters back. So, last, supporters say, now, again, that's stability. Maybe you think that's a good thing, maybe you think that's a bad thing, but some people like it. Maintains federal system of representation. What we mean by this is people who like the Electoral College like the fact that federalism is represented in it. States have power. Even a tiny state with very few people has an ability, like Iowa, for example, can impact presidential elections. So that's what the federalism system was designed to do, and some people like that. What about people who want to abolish the Electoral College? Well, obviously, one thing they don't like is that a presidential candidate can lose the popular vote but still be elected as president. And as you saw, that's happened 4 times. 5 if you count 1824, John Quincy Adams. And it's happened 2 times just in the last 22 years. So historical incidences, 1876, Samuel Tilden was a Democrat. He won the popular vote but lost the electoral majority to Rutherford B. Hayes. 1888, Grover Cleveland won the popular vote, but lost the electoral majority to Benjamin Harrison. 2000, Al Gore won the popular vote, but lost the electoral majority to George W. Bush. 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but lost the electoral majority to Donald Trump. Coincidentally, in all 4 of those incidences, the person who won the popular vote was a Democrat, and the person who won the Electoral College vote was a Republican. Some people think the Electoral College depresses voter turnout, and the idea is very simple. If you're a Democrat in Texas or a Republican in California, there's a disincentive to vote because you know you're not going to win that state anyway. See what I mean? If I'm a Republican in California and I want to vote for the Republican candidate in the 2024 election, I know I'm just doing it basically because I want to go through the process of voting. I know there's no chance that my candidate's going to win California, so in that sense, I'm wasting my time. Do a lot of people stay home and not bother voting? Probably, is the way this argument goes. Last, it distorts the population. It's an inaccurate reflection of the population. What they mean by that is, if you're part of a population like Wyoming, if you live here, you get 3 electoral votes. In California, I think you get 55, if I remember correctly. If you do the math, there are so few people in Wyoming that 3 electoral votes amounts to more votes per person than in California, where there are millions and millions more people. So in a sense, your electoral vote is magnified if you live in Wyoming, right? That's the argument. And so there are people who think this is just fundamentally undemocratic and unfair.